A cover story tonight. The United Nations owes $38 million to India. You must be wondering how the world body for peace is indebted to India. In many ways, we can say, but this one is in the books. These are unpaid dues. The United Nations has to pay India $38 million, the highest it has to pay to any country. This is payment for India's contribution to the UN's peacekeeping operations. The United Nations is facing financial trouble. They are unable to pay countries for contributing to peacekeeping missions. So India is not the only one, but India is the worst hit, if I may use that expression. The UN owes as much as $265 million to several countries. United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres is concerned. Here's what he said, and I'm quoting, "The United Nations is now effectively borrowing for prolonged periods from troop and police contributing countries. Many of them are low-income countries for which that imposes a significant financial burden." Now, Rwanda, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Nepal are some other countries that the UN owes money to. All of these are low-income countries, as he said, that are pulling more weight than the developed nations of the West. The UN's financial woes have been brewing for some time now. Earlier this year, India's permanent representative to the UN, Syed Akbaruddin, had raised this concern. A large chunk of the funding of the United Nations comes via contributions by member states. At the moment, the world body is facing liquidity problems, which basically means that the United Nations does not have enough cash to cover its expenses. The United Nations balance sheet was in the red by the end of 2018. It had a negative cash balance of $323 million. 8 years ago, the UN balance sheet was totally different. It had a positive cash balance of $412 million. That is how much it has deteriorated. So how soon can the UN pay India and the rest of its creditors? It is not clear. It depends on how quickly the United Nations can fix its balance sheet and arrange for more funds to cover the payments. The UN chief has now requested the General Assembly to create a peacekeeping fund of $250 million. They believe that this corpus should be enough to fix their funding problems. Now, the United Nations, as we know, is a bureaucratic behemoth. India was its founding member. The UN has been working towards peace in several regions around the world. India has been at the forefront of these peacekeeping operations. The fourth largest troop contributor to the UN, that is India. Here's what the blue helmets of the UN do.
Peacekeeping has proven to be one of the most effective tools available to the UN to assist countries navigate the difficult path from conflict to peace. Developing countries across the globe stricken by war and political unrest get assistance from the international community through UN peacekeeping missions. A majority of the personnel of the peacekeeping forces are drawn from the armed forces of the developing countries. UN peacekeepers provide security, political and peace-building support to the host countries, part of the UN Security Council. The UN peacekeeping missions allow the Security Council to watch over and participate in creating conditions for peace. Since 1948, the UN has helped end conflicts and foster reconciliation by conducting successful peacekeeping operations in many countries. Currently, there are 14 UN peacekeeping operations deployed on 4 continents: Africa, South America, Asia and Europe. The UN peacekeeping missions are guided by 3 basic principles. First, consent of the parties the peacekeeping operations are deployed with. The consent of the main parties in a conflict. Second, impartiality. The UN peacekeepers are required to be impartial in their dealings with the parties in conflict. And third, non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of mandate. UN peacekeeping missions are not an enforcement tool and should only use force as a last resort. UN peacekeeping originally developed as a means of dealing with interstate conflict, evolved over the years, with UN peacekeepers being asked to undertake a variety of complex tasks, from building sustainable institutions of governance and rebuilding a war-torn nation to even supervising elections. While the military presence remains the backbone of most peacekeeping missions, there are many others involved in peacekeeping. Administrators, economists, police officers, legal experts, deminers, electoral observers, human rights monitors, civil affairs and governance specialists, and communication and public information experts. The UN peacekeeping operations have undertaken multiple missions over the years. Though the efforts of the forces might not have yielded favorable results in all cases, it cannot be denied that a majority of them have been success stories. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
The United Nations is facing a financial crisis. At the heart of the problem is the financial contribution that every member state has to make. The UN issues regular budget assessments at the beginning of each year. After that, member states are required to pay their contributions in full within 30 days. But not all of them are doing so. Sample these numbers. So far, for 2019, only 74 member states have paid their contributions in full. And just for context, there are 193 countries that are members of the United Nations. Some countries neither pay in full nor on time. The result is this. Arrears stand at $529 million. A major culprit here is the United States. It owes more than $700 million to the peacekeeping budget. Otherwise, it owes nearly $400 million to the regular budget of the world body. India has met every financial obligation of the United Nations, so now it is time to ask questions. Is the United Nations fulfilling its end of the bargain? India is one of the main contributors to the regular budget of the UN. India also sends the highest number of troops to the UN peacekeeping missions. Then why does the United Nations world body feel helpless when it comes to acting on terror, on groups that act against India? Of course, we are talking about the listing of Masood Azhar as a global terrorist at the Security Council. It was backed by all members except China. This one instance is enough to prove that the United Nations needs reforms, it needs more teeth, and it needs to do more for countries that do so much for it. The present structure does not reflect the reality of today. When it comes to the issue of terrorism, the entire body is helpless before 5 countries that have the veto power. It's time for India to leverage its strong position at the United Nations. And all of this brings us to the pointed question, is the United Nations then a redundant body? Why am I asking this? Sure, it has stood as an institution for nearly 75 years. That's 3/4 of a century. But what does it do? The United Nations has rescued millions of people from abject poverty, malnutrition, starvation. That's all right. Its arms, such as the UNICEF, have provided education to many thousands of children. Yet, on a larger scale, questions remain. Big countries have made it a habit to flout the rules of the UN when it does not suit them. Take the example of the United States. On a fine morning in March 2003, the United States decided that diplomacy with Iraq had failed. The 2003 invasion of Iraq began a few days later. What did the UN do? It issued a statement. Kofi Annan, then the UN Secretary General, said, and I quote, "I have indicated that the US invasion of Iraq is not in conformity with the United Nations Charter. From our point of view, the Charter point of view, it is illegal." What does the statement even mean? Absolutely nothing. Because the United Nations does not have any power to stop a powerful country from acting like it wants to. The US said that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. They haven't yet shown those weapons to the world. They haven't found any, but Iraq was invaded nonetheless because Iraq had oil. As we speak, the United Nations and Russia are both flouting United Nations rules. The US and Russia are flouting UN rules in Syria. They fight each other, they take on each other, violating rules in a third country. And as they accuse each other, more violations come to light. Sample this one. A few months ago, Russia complained that the US had flouted a UN resolution on Syria. This relates to launching daily attacks in eastern Ghouta and Damascus, the capital of Syria. And Russia is no angel here. They have been accused of vetoing joint investigative mechanisms. If that was passed at the United Nations, the use of chemical weapons on people would have been investigated. Besides, the United Nations could not do anything about Russia's annexation of Crimea or America's sanctions on many countries. Nor could the UN act against Saudi Arabia or the US for funding the civil war in Yemen. This power, the ability of the United Nations Security Council members to veto decisions, has hurt the reputation of the global body. China regularly stalls action against terrorists in Pakistan. Some of them have masterminded terror attacks in India. Why is that so? But China can afford to play by its own rules. And China can make the United Nations bend to its will. So what's ailing the UN? This institution is bloated. It's insufficient economically, as I just explained, and nobody cares. The UN wants action on climate change. So what does it do? It organizes conferences where institutions and individuals speak of the perils of global warming. And then they get applause, they get attention, and nothing much happens. The UN cannot ask any country, especially the developed economies, to cut down on their use of fossil fuel. But the organization preaches developing countries like India and China to give up the use of traditional fuel. And it's operating on the brink of bankruptcy, even after correcting for inflation. The United Nations expenditure now is nearly 50 times higher than what it was in the 1950s. So what can be done? Should we not have an organization like the UN at all? After all, it was born for this purpose. And I'm quoting the second General Secretary of the United Nations. He said that the United Nations was created not to lead mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. Does it serve the purpose? Does it stop war? Does it have any influence over the powerful countries? Can a hearing at the UNSC guarantee action against rogue regimes, imperialist countries, terrorists, human rights abuses? Yes, there needs to be a global body to bring all countries under one umbrella. After all, humanity must engage, debate, discuss, and try to solve its problems collectively. But is the United Nations that platform anymore? I leave that question for you to ponder.